They said Royal Guards never speak, that they're trained to remain silent no matter what. Tourists yell, kids wave, even world leaders try to test them. But on this particular morning, during a joint UK-US ceremony, a high-ranking American general stepped past the rope line. 1 foot too far, one assumption too many. And the guard didn't stay silent. He shouted just 2 words. "Stand down!" Loud, commanding, enough to freeze the entire courtyard mid-step. People thought it was a breach of protocol. Some even thought he'd be punished. But then the reason came out: a name, a memory, and a past that connected 2 brothers across 2 uniforms, one alive, one buried. Now, before we show you exactly what happened next, and why even the general couldn't respond, first hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We post brand new Royal Guard stories every single day. And this one might be the most quietly devastating yet. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Crowd gathered early that morning, long before the official schedule began. Horse Guards parade glistened under a grey London sky. The kind of overcast that never quite commits to rain but still manages to dampen every sound. Tourists pressed against the rope lines, with phones already raised, hoping to catch a glimpse of history, even if they weren't quite sure what they were looking at. It was a joint ceremonial review. British and American military dignitaries assembled for a day of pageantry and shared symbolism. A display of alliance, tradition, and mutual respect. And of course, cameras, both official and civilian, were everywhere. Near the front gate stood Lance Sergeant Marcus Clark. Coldstream Guards, immaculately uniformed in scarlet wool and tall black bearskin hat, late 30s, broad-shouldered, composed, immovable. He had the kind of presence that made children fall silent and adults speak in whispers. What most in the crowd didn't know was that Clark had been selected for this post, not because he volunteered, but because he never said no. He never did anything for attention, never broke form. His was a name quietly passed through command as someone who could be counted on when it mattered. And today, it mattered. Because the Americans had brought a guest, General Cole Wallace. 4 stars, polished boots, a jaw carved out of West Point tradition, and the kind of smile that said, "I don't wait for ceremonies to finish before I act." A battlefield legend turned military liaison, Wallace had been flown in to symbolically review the guard, an honorific gesture with no actual authority. Clark had seen the brief. He knew the face. Everyone did. When Wallace stepped onto the forecourt with his entourage, the energy shifted. He didn't wait for the formal signal, didn't ask where the invisible lines were. He simply strode forward, gesturing for a young American soldier in his party to step closer. A tourist in a baseball cap muttered, "That guy allowed to do that." A British captain began to move forward, to intercept, maybe clarify, but he never got the chance, because Clark spoke. The command came sharp, precise, and loud enough to bounce off the stone walls of the Treasury building behind them. "Stand down, sir!" A ripple tore through the crowd. Phones jerked upward. Gasps followed. Wallace stopped mid-step. The American soldier halted, eyes wide. Even the pigeons seemed to freeze for a moment. The voice had come from the guard, from the man in red who wasn't supposed to speak, the one whose silence was the spectacle. And yet, there he stood, posture unbroken, rifle still shouldered, but voice ringing out with absolute authority. Tourists looked around, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. "Did that guard just yell at a general?" someone whispered. An older woman clutched her handbag with both hands. "Is that allowed?" The British officers on the perimeter didn't move. Neither did Clark. And neither did Wallace. He stared at the guard, blinking once, then twice, as if trying to compute what had just occurred. Slowly, deliberately, Wallace took one more step forward, toward the man who had just called him out in front of 2 nations. Clark didn't blink. Wallace's boots clicked against the stone. He stopped directly in front of the guard, studied his face, what little could be seen under the bearskin shadow, and then dropped his gaze to the nameplate. Clark. The general's brow furrowed, and then something unexpected happened. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something quieter, sharper. He took one step back, tilted his head, and said quietly, "Clark." "From Heron Platoon, Afghanistan. Irandairat the one brother?" Clark said nothing. But now the silence wasn't ceremonial, it was personal. The silence didn't just hang, it pressed down on the courtyard like a storm that had forgotten how to break. Even the most restless tourists were still now, their phones suddenly feeling out of place in their hands. The general had just spoken the guard's name like it meant something. And not just any name, he'd said Heron Platoon, Afghanistan, 2009. Remained still, utterly still. But inside, the words landed like shrapnel in soft ground. Across the stone flags, a nearby captain shifted his weight, ready to approach. But something in Clark's bearing stopped him. This wasn't a man losing control. This was something far deeper, a confrontation between past and present that no one had expected to unfold in front of Buckingham Palace's more sober cousin. General Wallace didn't move either. Instead, he glanced to the side, at the American soldier he'd beckoned earlier, and gave the faintest shake of his head. The young private backed off immediately, retreating behind the rope line. Then Wallace returned his eyes to Clark. "Your brother," he said slowly. "Dean Clark. Corporal, you're his brother." It wasn't a question, it was a realization. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a woman gasped. The name meant nothing to most people watching, but the tone did. They were witnessing something not part of the choreography. Clark's lips parted for the first time. His voice was low, even, carried not on emotion, but on discipline that had chosen to speak. "This post is in honour of Corporal Dean Clark, Coldstream Guards, KIA, Sangin District, March 4th, 2009. The words weren't for the crowd, they were for the general, for the man who had survived that day, flown out in the same Black Hawk that never had room for Dean's body. Wallace's face tightened, a small muscle in his jaw jumped. "I know what happened that day," he said. Clark responded immediately, without heat, without hesitation. "No, sir, you remember what happened. I know." Another ripple moved through the assembled officers. The captain, who had started to step forward, took a breath and stopped. Lieutenant Commander Ford, standing at the far edge of the perimeter, narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Wallace glanced briefly at the nearby tourists, then back to Clark. "This isn't the place," he murmured. Clark's voice came again, calm, precise, clipped with ceremonial authority. "You crossed the southern perimeter. Before clearance was issued, you broke the chain of movement. My brother stepped forward to correct it. You got pulled. He didn't." Wallace flinched, just slightly, just enough for the nearby onlookers to catch. "I didn't know he was covering rear," Wallace muttered. Clark didn't blink. He did, and command blamed poor terrain, called it fog of war, wrote it up as a logistics failure, but everyone in Heron knew. You rushed the line, and he paid for it. Wallace opened his mouth, then closed it. A few feet away, a British schoolboy clutched his souvenir flag tighter. His teacher reached for his shoulder and gently pulled him back. Nobody moved. No one dared. Even the guards, stationed further down the parade line, guards trained to ignore everything, seemed to stand with a different kind of stillness now. The kind that wasn't about duty. It was about respect. Wallace exhaled. "I never forgot him," he said. Clark answered with silence, not hostility, not forgiveness, just the kind of silence that cannot be broken with words. Then Wallace did something no one expected. He straightened his shoulders, stepped back behind the rope line, and raised his hand, not in salute, but in withdrawal, a gesture that said, "I am no longer on this ground. You are." The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't move. It simply watched as the general rejoined his delegation and folded his hands behind his back, eyes forward like any other visitor. Clark didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He had returned to silence, but nothing about it was empty. It took several seconds for the mood to adjust. Even then, it didn't so much shift as settle. Tourists who had arrived expecting marching boots and snapping rifles were now holding their breath, watching two figures who stood barely feet apart, one in full red ceremonial uniform, the other in dress blues, hands behind his back, flanked by foreign dignitaries who suddenly looked very small. General Wallace didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His step backward had said everything. But Clark remained unmoving, unshaken. And in that silence, something passed through the assembled crowd. Not just curiosity, but something like reverence. Even those with no military connection seemed to understand. They'd witnessed a fracture in tradition that had revealed something deeper underneath. A young British officer, Lieutenant Harper, whispered to the captain beside him, "What just happened?" The captain, older, steadier, eyes pinned on Clark, didn't turn. That was the name of the man who saved Wallace's life, and the brother who never let anyone forget. For a moment, nothing else was said. But from the American delegation, one younger soldier leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "Dean Clark? Wasn't he on that Helmand list?" The other nodded, voice low. "Yeah, posthumously honoured, never talked about why." And suddenly it was all there, floating just beneath the surface. Dean Clark, British corporal attached to a joint US-UK platoon in Helmand Province, 2009. Wallace was leading a convoy extraction, pinned down, comms jammed. A miscalculation in movement protocol sent him walking across unsecured ground too early. Dean had stayed behind to redirect a late vehicle and was caught in the open. Took the brunt of the ambush. Bought Wallace the seconds he needed. The official report called it tragic misalignment. Quietly buried the circumstances. The media called it heroic. Briefly, then moved on. But Marcus Clark hadn't. He had joined the Guard 2 years later and quietly, precisely, rose through the ranks without ever once breaking protocol until now. A murmur stirred through the crowd. One of the British press correspondents lowered his camera. "Should I roll?" he asked. His producer just shook his head. "If you didn't get it already, you've missed it." Across the rope line, Lieutenant Commander Ford, a senior British officer in ceremonial black and gold, stepped forward. Slow, controlled, not quite breaking form, but coming close. He approached Clark's position, paused beside him, and said nothing at first. Then, low enough for only Clark and the nearest officers to hear, "It's been 15 years?" Clark said nothing. Ford nodded slightly. "And you stood for all of them." Still no response, but something about Ford's posture changed. A slight shift in the shoulders, a narrowing of the eyes. Then he added, "You know what'll happen. Review board'll say you breached protocol." This time Clark spoke. Not a protest, just a simple reply. "I'm prepared." Looked at him a moment longer, then glanced toward the still watching general. "He's not going to file anything. I doubt he'll speak of it again." Clark said nothing, just held his position, bearing the weight of stillness like armour. A child in the front row asked his father, "Is he in trouble?" The man, uncertain, knelt beside his son and said, "I don't think so, mate. I think he just remembered something more important." It was then that someone else stepped forward. Not a soldier, not a diplomat, but a civilian. An elderly man in a long coat and British Legion pin. He moved slowly, respectfully, and took off his flat cap. He didn't approach Clark directly, just stood quietly beside the rope line and gave a nod. Not a salute, not a photo op, just a silent acknowledgement. A few feet away, a woman in her 40s, American accent clearly visiting, leaned to her husband and said, "I thought they weren't supposed to talk." He replied softly, "Maybe some things are bigger than the silence." And with that, the moment passed. The ceremony had not resumed. There was no need, because everyone on that parade ground now understood what the red uniform really meant. It wasn't just about stillness. It was about memory. And today, memory had spoken. The wind moved gently across the forecourt, lifting the edges of ceremonial banners and catching against the brass on Clark's chest plate. It was the only thing that moved. The rest of the courtyard remained frozen in something close to reverence. General Wallace didn't leave. He stood just beyond the rope line now, still as any spectator, his face a tight composition of years he didn't speak of, years that Marcus Clark remembered far too well. For a moment, it felt like everything, the pomp, the flags, the brass instruments waiting in silence, had peeled away, leaving just two men standing between past and present. Then Clark spoke. Not to Wallace, not to the crowd, but to the air in front of him, like a man reciting something already etched in stone. Dean Clark, Corporal, Coldstream Guards, Joint Operational Tasking, Operation Herrick 11, killed while ensuring another man's retreat. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't performing. It was just a reading of facts, except these were the kind of facts that couldn't be written into medals. He paused. Last words recorded were, "Go, I've got you covered." General Wallace inhaled slowly. He remembered those words too. Only in his memory they weren't noble. They were panicked, urgent, carried on static and blood and too much dust. He didn't speak them aloud. He didn't have to. Clark continued, softer now. He wanted to transfer back home after that deployment. Had plans for university. Studied architecture on his own time. A pause. He was 23. No ceremony had ever said that part. There was no room for it in the black letters carved into the marble at Westminster Abbey. No space for it in the 8-word citation that accompanied the small posthumous commendation Dean's mother received in a stiff envelope 2 months later. But today, in red wool and immovable posture, his brother had said it, and it landed louder than any trumpet fanfare ever could. Wallace finally spoke again, low and slow. "I thought I could fix it." I gave his name to Honours Board, made sure they remembered it. Clark's gaze didn't shift, and yet you crossed the rope again. The words weren't laced with malice. They were worse. They were disappointment delivered in perfect discipline. Wallace didn't reply. His hands tightened behind his back. Near the edge of the crowd, Sergeant Whitmore, one of Clark's fellow guardsmen, whispered to another soldier. He was never going to say anything, but you could see it. Every time he stood post near the cenotaph, he was somewhere else. The younger soldier nodded. Wasn't just standing. He was keeping something standing. The atmosphere had changed entirely now. Nobody asked when the next marching drill would resume. No one shouted for photos. Even the street noise beyond Whitehall seemed distant, irrelevant. Clark's voice broke the stillness once more, but not for drama, just to finish what needed saying. This uniform isn't silence, it's remembrance. And that was it. No drama, no applause, just a single line spoken in a place that wasn't built for speeches, but remembered every word anyway. Wallace gave a faint nod. Whether it was apology or respect, no one could say. Then he stepped back another pace and merged into the line of foreign officials, smaller now, less certain. Clark did not move, because that was never the point. The air was different now, not heavy, just settled, like a storm that had passed without thunder, leaving only clarity behind. General Wallace remained with his delegation, standing silently among aides and attachés who no longer whispered into earpieces. The moment that had broken form was over. But nobody had quite returned to normal. The ropes still separated the crowd from the ceremonial ground, but it felt less like a boundary now, and more like a line someone had paid dearly to defend. Lance Sergeant Clark remained motionless. The crimson of his tunic caught the light just slightly as clouds shifted overhead. His eyes were fixed ahead, not on Wallace, not on the tourists, but on the weight of the ground beneath him. It was the same parade square his brother had once walked across as a young cadet before heading off to war. The same ground from which his coffin had departed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. A boy near the front, 10, maybe 11, tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, what did he do wrong?" The father paused, struggling for an answer, then finally said, "He told someone to stop, because some things matter more than rank." Away, a woman in her 60s folded her hands at her waist, tears brimming but unshed. She'd been filming, but her phone now rested idle against her chest. From the other side of the court, Sergeant Whitmore shifted slightly in formation. It wasn't visible to the crowd, but Clark would have noticed a signal. Not of approval, not of sympathy, just recognition. That's how guardsmen speak. General Wallace slowly exhaled, gave one final glance toward Clark, and turned away. His posture was correct, but the swagger was gone. For once, he blended in with the rest of the delegation. One step backward had cost him nothing physically. But in the eyes of the people watching, it had meant everything. He didn't try to reclaim the moment, didn't speak to press, didn't shake any hands. He knew, perhaps better than anyone now, that the story wasn't his to shape. And across from him, the man in the red tunic, the one who had broken silence in the name of remembrance, stood exactly where he'd been from the start. Rifle firm, chin up, bearing unmoved. Because some things aren't about being seen, they're about being there. The final notes of the ceremony resumed on cue, a full 5 minutes behind schedule, but nobody cared. The band struck up a quiet interlude, and the guard continued their rotation as if nothing unusual had happened. But the crowd knew better. Every movement now felt more deliberate. Every salute, every footstep, a little heavier, a little more honest. And as the guard marched away from the forecourt, Clark was among them. Not in front, not lagging behind, just exactly where he was supposed to be. When the ceremony finally concluded, the crowd lingered longer than usual. Tourists didn't rush to leave. Some stood in place, staring at the emptying forecourt as if waiting for something more. Others spoke in low voices, unsure whether they had witnessed history or simply something more human than the usual display. The guards filed back through the archway in perfect rhythm. Boots echoed in sequence across the stone, ritual in motion, undisturbed by the emotional charge that had just passed through. Clark was the last to step off the parade ground, his rifle cradled with practiced precision. He disappeared into the arch just as the band finished their final note. Beyond the public's view, down the interior hall where ceremonial meets operational, Clark removed his bearskin hat with quiet deliberation. His short-cropped hair was soaked in sweat, his breathing slow, controlled. Then came the footsteps, sharp, clipped, unmistakable. Lieutenant Commander Ford approached from the west corridor, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. 2 other officers followed behind, but kept their distance. This was not going to be a reprimand in front of an audience. Ford stopped a few paces in front of Clark, looked him in the eye. "Technically," he said, voice dry, "you broke form." Clark stood at ease, shoulders broad, eyes forward. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. That would have cheapened it. "Yes, sir." Ford studied him for a moment longer. "You understand what that means?" "I do, sir." Ford tilted his head slightly, just enough to signal that he wasn't reading from the manual now. "We'll log it as a procedural deviation. Internal review might flag it. They might not." A pause. "But if they ask me for a recommendation..." He looked directly at Clark. "I'll tell them you did exactly what was needed." Clark didn't nod, didn't blink, but something in his jaw relaxed slightly. Ford added, "Next time, if there ever is one, don't say it louder." Another pause. "Say it sooner." Then, without ceremony, Ford turned on his heel and left. Behind him, one of the younger officers, the same lieutenant who had whispered about Heron platoon, caught Clark's eye as he passed. He didn't speak, just gave the faintest nod of respect. The kind of nod that carries weight in a place like this. Clark turned back to his locker, began unfastening his buttons one at a time. Each movement methodical, practiced. The uniform came off piece by piece, not discarded, but folded, with precision born of both discipline and reverence. Because for Clark, that uniform wasn't just fabric, it was history, grief, memory, and something deeper, duty to the unspoken. When Sergeant Whitmore passed by on his way out, he didn't say anything either, just slowed his stride enough to brush shoulders with Clark as he passed. Sometimes in the Guard, that's the loudest thing you can do. The footage never aired on television. A few handheld recordings surfaced online, half-cut, blurry, mostly shaky audio where the shout of "Stand down, sir!" pierced through faint static. But within hours, most of those clips were removed, not by force, just quietly gone, flagged for unauthorized military filming. A polite, firm sweep of digital broom work. Some said the British MOD intervened. Others said it was the Americans, eager to avoid headlines that read, "General reprimanded by ceremonial guard." People didn't even notice. The moment passed like so many do, important to a few, invisible to the rest. But not everyone forgot. Among those who had been there, word spread like whispered folklore. An email circulated among junior officers titled, "The Day the Guard Spoke." One caption beneath a blurred image read, "He broke silence to preserve something louder." In a tucked-away break room at Wellington Barracks, a laminated note appeared beside the tea kettle a week later. No author, no signature. Just a single quote, printed in clean black text. "Tradition is not stillness. It is knowing when to move." Clark never commented on what happened that day, not in writing, not to the press, not even over a quiet pint with fellow guards. His file remained unaltered, except for a brief line in his quarterly review. Exercised disciplined initiative during bilateral event. No further action required. General Wallace returned to the United States later that week, gave a speech at Annapolis, shook hands, posed for photographs. The transcript of his remarks made no mention of London, but those close to him noticed something different. He no longer stepped over ropes. And the next time someone offered him ceremonial clearance to review a guard, he politely declined, replying, "I've already been reviewed." For Clark, he rotated stations the following month. No promotion, no punishment, just another post, another gate, another day beneath the shadow of history. But those who had stood with him noticed something subtle. Guards now checked their form, not just for posture, but for meaning. New recruits whispered stories they weren't sure were true. And every now and then, when a tourist leaned too close or called out for a smile, they caught themselves, wondering if this was that guard, the one who broke silence, not for anger, not for pride, but for memory. Do you think the guard was right to break silence that day? Should rank ever override remembrance? Or is there a line even generals shouldn't cross? And if you had been in that crowd, would you have noticed what really happened? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one and we'd love to hear your take. If this story stayed with you, even for just a moment, go ahead and tap that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on so you never miss a day with the Guard. And if you know someone who still thinks those uniforms are just for show, share this video with them. It might just change the way they see tradition. There's another story waiting for you right now on screen. Click it next and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new moment that proves silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment to speak.